My son watched his wife spit on me. He never imagined what I'd do next. The saliva hit the side of my face like someone had thrown a glass of cold water. It was warm in a way that made my skin prickle, the sudden salt of it, the shock of being dismissed with the single intentional gesture she'd practiced in a dozen small cruelties before that morning. For a second, I stood frozen, my cheek damp, the kitchen lights too bright, the clock ticking like an accusation. David, my son, was there, right beside her. He didn't move. He looked at me the way people look at a broken thing they don't know how to fix. What do you do in a moment like that? I could tell you about the roaring that wanted to rise up in my chest, about the way years of quiet indignity swelled into a single hot tide. I could tell you I lunged, that I shouted, that I packed a suitcase and called the police. None of those things happened. I walked to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed. I felt every choice, every compromise I'd ever made set down alongside that spit. If you're out there watching this, tell me where you're from in the comments below. I want to know who's listening. And if you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. It helps people who've lived through something similar find these conversations. You should know the house, because the house matters. My husband and I bought it in the 70s, when shag carpet was acceptable and the mortgage was something you paid off by the time the kids left home. We raised David here. He learned to ride a bike in that driveway, tracked mud into the kitchen on summer evenings, and crammed for exams at the dining room table. When his father died, it was this house that felt like a rope tied to everything that mattered. For 35 years, it has been mine as much as it ever was ours. I kept the garden tidy. I remembered birthdays. I paid the taxes on time. I paid the mortgage when it needed paying. After he died, the house became a ledger of memory and a careful plan, an investment account set up for me to live comfortably in my later years, a commercial property that had been in the family, and small things set away for the grandchildren. David came back the first time because he had nowhere else. He had a falling out with a boyfriend years before, a messy split that left him shaken, and he spent a few months crashing on my couch. I told him it was temporary. He told himself the same. But temporary has a way of stretching if you let it. Jobs came and went. Rent got paid late. One mortgage missed turned into another, and then the idea of moving when things settled became a comfortable fiction. He wasn't a bad son. He'd been my son. He was a man who, in the softness of my home, had made a life shaped around the notion that someone else would pick up the slack. Jessica moved in with them 6 months after David came back. She had a quick laugh and a quicker temper. At first, she cooked meals and helped with dishes. She made friends easily and painted the spare bedroom a color she loved. That's how inside people get in. They start by making things useful and pretty. Then small demands arrived, like half-forgotten bills. Can I borrow some money for this? Could you watch the children for a few days? Is it okay if we keep the car here? Each favor, each kindness became another thread tangled around the idea that my home was, if not public property, then at least a revolving door. It didn't take long for boundaries to be ignored. They took things without asking. Antiques my husband had loved, my grandmother's dishes. When I protested, I was met with sighs and accusations of being dramatic. I learned to pick my battles because the war would have cost me more than a jar of china. But there are thresholds that cannot be crossed without consequence. Spitting on a person is one of them. That morning, after the spit, I closed my bedroom door. I could hear them, plates clinking, the television on low, and a low conversation in the hallway. I thought about the last 12 months, the small slights strung together until they looked like a rope. I thought about my husband's picture on the mantel, the way his eyes seemed to ask me what I would do. Nobody was going to fight that fight for me. I slept on it. Or rather, I lay awake thinking of things in a way I hadn't permitted myself to think since I watched my husband die, calmly, as if from a distance. Revenge flashed through my mind in bright, ridiculous ways. Pranks I'd laugh about later, a scene of poetic justice that made my mouth curve. But then the anger cooled, and something clearer took its place. If you're going to respond to being disrespected in your own home, you don't get to do it on your knees in the dark or at the edge of a shouting match. You get to do it deliberately. You get to act from the only place you really control, your own choices. The next morning, I made pancakes. Not the soggy, instant flapjacks they feed breakfast for one with. I made real pancakes, the kind that steam on the griddle and smell like Sunday mornings. I set the table with the good plates. I boiled eggs, made coffee, and laid out butter in a dish. David walked into the kitchen half asleep, and Jessica followed, still scowling as if the spit had been her polite way of giving an order. They expected something else entirely. The same old easy acceptance. Instead, they found a table set like a show. "Good morning," I said. They sat down, somewhat puzzled, and started to eat. I kept my tone breezy, like an actress committing to a role, and when the pancakes came, I placed a plate in front of an empty chair at the head of the table. "Someone else is joining us," I said. They looked up, and then he saw him. Thomas Richardson is not the sort of man you forget. He's a small, neat man, gray at the temples, with a businesslike smile and a briefcase that contains more pens than any briefcase needs. He came in with a measured step, nodded to Susan from 2 doors down, who waved back with a muffin in hand, and sat at the head of my table the way a conductor takes a podium. The room tightened. Jessica's spoon froze midway to her mouth. David's jaw went hard. I could see the old boyish worry in his eyes, the same look he'd had the day he failed a math test and wanted me to make it easier. Thomas did not waste time with small talk. He didn't have to. There was a shift in the air the way there is between the second and third act of a play, when the stakes are clarified and the audience leans forward. "Good morning," Thomas said, and then he asked me the question that had been settling in my bones all night. "What do you want to happen here?" I could have said 100 things. I could have said, "I want an apology." I could have said, "I want them gone right now." I could have told David to choose between his wife and his mother, but the choice I made was one that would hold them to their actions instead of letting them slide away with excuses. "I want them to leave," I said, "but I also want them to learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. I don't want to fuel a dependency that will become a prison for everyone." Thomas nodded as if I had handed him a difficult instrument he'd been trained to play. He explained in plain terms the language I needed to hear, not legalese, but steady facts, that actions in a household have consequences, that there are documents that can make those consequences clear, that wills and accounts and contracts are not just pieces of paper. They are deterrents when used wisely. I listened like someone taking notes. He was careful, as a good lawyer is, to say that laws vary from place to place. He said words like assault and enforcement, but he always folded them into my experience. In my state, in my case, this is what I could do. He never promised miracles. He promised options. Then I told them about the comics. It makes people laugh when I say the word comics, like I'm confessing to a guilty pleasure. My husband collected them obsessively when he was young. He had boxes in the basement, boxes I'd seen decade after decade as we moved from garage sales to retirement parties. They were insignificant, I thought, except for the way some of them still smelled of ink and damp cardboard, and the way my husband would pause and smile when his finger found a title he used to read as a boy. Over the years they'd been neglected, but not lost. In the lid of one of those boxes I'd found something curious, a set of mint condition issues that smart collectors would pay a pretty penny for. I didn't know what they were worth, so I looked them up. One of the sellers quoted a current bid that took my breath away, $8,000 on a single lot. I sat with that number on the couch like it was a small, fragrant loaf I could slice and eat. It didn't change the past, but it changed the room. I told them I had already listed a few items on eBay. I didn't say to spite you or to punish you. I said it plainly. The comics are my property, and I had a right to control them. The current bid, I said without flourish, was $8,000. David's face changed when I said it. For a second, the fatigue of middle age fell away, and he looked like a boy who'd just realized there were consequences to leaving his bike in the street. Jessica's jaw tightened, and she finally spoke, the words landing like a thrown glove. "You're not serious." "I am," Thomas said, and the room shrank. "Mrs. Williams has the right to her property. She also has the right to set conditions for those who live under her roof." It was one thing to threaten with words. It is another thing to show consequences in the form of something immediate and visible. The comics were tangible. The will was tangible. Thomas slid a piece of paper across the table. Not a full will, but a summary of possible changes. A plain list that said, in effect, disrespect and violation of the household will affect access to certain assets. I described the investment account my husband had set aside, the one that had been carefully managed and now held around $400,000. I mentioned, without dramatics, the commercial property we still owned, a brick building downtown that had once attracted a serious offer of $1.8 million before a buyer fell through. These were not threats. They were the ledger of our life together, the things anyone reading my will would find. Jake, that's what Thomas called the legal shorthand for when someone asked about how to make changes, explained that the best deterrents are clear expectations paired with consequences. "Make the rules," he said simply. "Make sure they know the rules, and make the penalties proportional and enforceable." He was careful with his words, careful with the law. He kept repeating that local rules can change the way things play out. He wasn't promising a quick eviction. He was promising that a plan could exist. David swallowed. He had 1,000 answers stuttering in his throat, excuses for the missing dishes, for the lateness of rent, for the way his wife treated me. But when money is on the table, people suddenly see numbers. I could tell that ego and habit and the ache of being dependent wrestled inside him. I let him wrestle. "We have to think about safety," Thomas added quietly, and he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the whole three of us, to the woman who spat, to the man who froze, and to the matriarch who had decided that something needed to change. Sometimes a clear contract with timelines and milestones is more effective than a long-standing spoken agreement. I had Thomas draft one. I told him what I wanted in plain terms: 90 days to demonstrate independence, weekly contributions to household expenses, active job hunting, attendance at counseling sessions for the marriage, respect for private property and for my rules in my house, and an immediate vacate clause for gross violations. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clear, enforceable steps that would either change them or make them go. It's a strange thing to offer your children a chance in the form of a timetable, but it's the same as giving a teenager a curfew. You are not trying to trap them. You are trying to teach them boundaries. They read the summary over coffee. Jessica's lip curled. David's hands trembled a little as he held the paper. He read the words and tried to find the softer meanings in them, hoping the paper would fold into an apology. It didn't. "Can we negotiate?" he asked. His voice was thin with pleading. He wanted a way to keep the house without doing the work to deserve it. "No," I said. It was the hardest word I'd spoken in years. Saying it felt like stepping into a current. "You can accept it, or you can go. But if you stay, there are conditions." A silence fell like a curtain. For a moment I saw my husband's hand on my shoulder in a memory, and I used that remembered strength. "Take the papers home tonight," Thomas said. "Talk it over. We don't have to sign anything today, but if you stay under her roof, you'll need to be aware of the terms." They left the kitchen that afternoon with plates still half cleaned and a tension that pulsed in the air like a second heartbeat. I washed the dishes slowly, listening to the water, letting the ordinary motion calm me. I had started a thing. That sounded dramatic, but it wasn't dramatic. It was practical. I had set a boundary. The rest would unfold in time. Over the next few days, the small ruptures in the household became laboratory experiments in behavior. Jessica tested the boundaries the way pets prod a fence. She moved things, went through drawers she'd been told not to, and watched to see how I would react. The first time she opened a locked bureau and rifled through my papers, I found her standing in the hall, the smell of detergent on her sleeves, and the guilty hesitation of a child caught with a hand in a cookie jar. "You pay for your curiosity," I said, and I meant it without malice. I meant it with the gravity of someone who had watched small things become unattended avalanches. I told her I'd documented the violation. That phrase made her laugh in a brittle way, an attempt to regain control. "You can laugh," I said, "but documentation doesn't have to be dramatic. It's a record. It's a way of saying, this is what happened." I didn't advise anyone to record. I stated a fact as it applied to me in my jurisdiction. Laws differ, I always reminded them, and I never presented my steps as a universal manual. David tried to mediate. He tried to convince me that things could change if I softened. He started leaving money on the table, a few dollars here and there as though cash absolved responsibility. I took the money and put it aside in an envelope labeled household contributions, an accounting habit I've held since my 20s. Money has a way of clarifying intentions. When someone insists on giving you money without account, it can be meant as a bribe or a bandage. I wanted accountability, not bandages. On the 15th day, I received a call from Thomas that made the room in my chest open up like a window. He said that if they were to accept the terms, we would make them sign a simple agreement reflecting the 90-day plan. It would not be punitive. It would be a clear list of expectations and consequences. For me, that was all I needed. A structure, a timeline. "You sure?" he asked on the phone, his voice softer than in the kitchen. "You know this will make waves." "Let it make waves," I said. For the first time in weeks, I felt almost playful. There was power in the thought that the dignity of my home mattered more than avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. If they can step up, good. If they can't, then the house won't be a place where enabling happens. He arranged a time for all of us to come back to the table. He suggested we sign the agreement in my living room so there would be a witness. I thought of the little things that witness means. The neighbor who waves, the mail carrier, the world that sees what we do and knows what it took to do it. That night, after they had gone to bed, I walked down to the basement. The boxes were in the far corner, under a sheet that smelled faintly of mildew. I hauled them out with the deliberation of someone unwrapping a relic. The comics looked smaller than I remembered, fragile and stubborn. Some were in plastic sleeves, preserved by someone who thought these paper treasures might outlast us all. I took photographs, not to teach anyone how to document, only as a record for myself, and I made a list. The lot I'd found had a current bid of $8,000. $8,000 sits heavy and loud in the middle of a quiet room. It is not enough to retire on, but it is enough to change a few immediate facts. You have to understand, I didn't list them because I wanted to force them out on a whim. I listed them because I needed leverage. People who have lived on the margins of kindness learn that leverage is the only thing that curtails repeated offenses. If their comfortable life had no stakes, nothing would change. If their actions had no teeth, they would become a habit. I wanted choices to have weight. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts. David began to look at job listings on his phone, not the casual, "I'll do something soon" kind of scrolling, but real searches, construction, delivery driving, administrative temp work. Jessica, who had been resistant to the idea of work beyond odd errands, began to resent the time I spent going through bills, as if I were reading their future aloud. She started snapping, a brittle edge to her voice that sounded like a woman who didn't want to give anything she couldn't control. One afternoon, while they were both out, a neighbor knocked on my door. She'd heard a raised voice, she said. She'd seen Jessica storm out and then come back with a bag and a sob that was too loud. The neighbor's eyes were full of something like concern. It was a small thing, but every small thing stacked up in my mind until the room tilted. I saw the pattern of avoidance and deflection, and how it had been eating away at the kindness I'd been giving until there was nothing left to give. The notification of the eBay bid arrived on my phone at 2:17 p.m. The sort of mundane detail that suddenly reads like a line in a novel. I watched the bids rise. $1,200, $2,500, $5,000, $8,000. The numbers were small facts, but they made the air different. David saw the notification while making coffee. He looked at the screen and then looked up at me, like someone seeing an unexpected price on a bill they thought would never come. "You were serious," he said, voice low. "I was," I answered, and his silence felt like assent. The contract Thomas drafted was spare. It read like a checklist of decency: 90 days to find work or demonstrate financial independence, weekly household contributions equal to a reasonable share of expenses, enrollment in financial counseling or classes, attendance at least 3 counseling or mediation sessions to address the marital conflict, respect for the house and its contents, and an immediate vacate clause for any form of assault, threats, or theft. There was a clause about restitution for items taken without permission, and a note that violation of privacy would result in immediate enforcement actions. I know how this reads. Punitive, perhaps, but it's a map, and maps show direction. When Thomas slid the draft across the living room table, their reactions were instructive. David's hands were steady at first, then fluttered. He read it like a man reading terms he had always assumed did not apply to him. Jessica raked her fingers through her hair and laughed a laugh that had nothing in it. 90 days, she scoffed. You can't just make us disappear like that. Actually, Thomas said calmly, you can accept the terms and work them, or you can leave. Either way, there is a choice. The gravity of the choice landed in David's face like rain. For a brief moment, I felt the old ache again. The worry that being stern would break him. The fear that being kind would make me complicit. I chose neither to break nor to collude. I chose to set an external standard and see if they could meet it. They slept in the house that night as usual, though the bed seemed like a smaller, more temporary thing under the weight of what we had discussed. At 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of a muffled conversation in the living room. I did not go down immediately. I listened. David was speaking in a voice that was soft and genuine in a way that made my heart twist. Mom, we'll do it. We'll try. And then Jessica saying, in a tone I'd heard before, but softened, we'll figure it out. I did not know then whether they were promising to change or promising to pace a scene they hoped would leave the house as it was. Hope, however small, can be a dangerous thing when used to postpone accountability. But I allowed myself to sleep. 2 weeks after our breakfast with Thomas, they had an interview at a warehouse for daytime shifts. David came home with the smallest of triumphs, a call that had progressed to a first interview. He wore his father's old coat feel, careful, trying not to be noticed energy. Jessica, to my surprise, filled out applications at a nearby supermarket and for an administrative temp agency. I bought them grocery cards and suggested, without dramatics, a financial class at the community college being held on Wednesday nights. I did not want to infantilize them, nor did I want to hand them a life on a tray. I wanted to see activity. Action speaks, even when the voice is hesitant. On the 27th day, a low tremor came through our house. It sounded like a small thing. A voicemail notification from a woman named Patricia Sullivan, an estate attorney who had been representing my late husband's distant cousin in matters of a commercial lease. Patricia was precise and professional. She had the voice of someone who handled money for a living. She left a message asking if I had a moment to return her call about an administrative issue. I listened to the message twice, then called her back from my kitchen counter with my hand wrapped around a mug that had seen worse mornings than this. Patricia's voice was brisk on the phone. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "I need to discuss an escrow issue that has come to my attention regarding a property formerly under the estate of a business partner. It's complicated, but in short, there may be funds, significant funds, that were misapplied and are now being returned to the estate. I felt my breath hitch at the edges of her words. How much? I asked, because asking how much is a deeply human thing. It is not greed. It is a practical requirement when real consequences have to be weighed. There's approximately $743,000 currently in escrow, she said. There's also been renewed interest in the commercial property. We had an offer. Previously, it was at $1.8 million, and there's movement again on that front. Her voice told me she was not making promises. She was simply reporting facts. These are not finalized, Mrs. Williams. They require paperwork, signatures, and time. But legally, if the funds are released, they may be distributed per the estate documents. A photo of the comics went heavy in my hands like a paper bird. The existence of money suddenly turned family negotiations into a different kind of conversation. The ledger of our life was not something I could toss aside. It needed to be considered. The investment account with around $400,000 was real, a cushion I'd expected to make retirement slow and comfortable. The possibility of an additional sum floating into the picture made the room tilt. I sat down. The kitchen light hummed. Outside, a delivery truck rattled by like a distant drum. I did what most people do when presented with a sudden, enormous question. I made a list. Part of me whispered the old, hard thing I'd been taught growing up, that you help, and you help quietly. Another part of me, wise from years of small betrayals, whispered back that help without conditions had been what led us here. How you steward those resources mattered as much as whether you had them. That night, the house felt like a boat tilting toward a shoreline you could not yet see. David and Jessica's voices crept through the hallway, slicing into the quiet with a practical panic about rent, deposits, and whether the furniture in the living room belonged to me or to them. They argued quietly at first, then more loudly, the way people do when fear compels them to shout. I closed my bedroom door and let the argument fold like laundry at the foot of the bed. I thought of Thomas's words about deterrence and structure. I thought about the comics and the $8,000 current bid that hummed like a small practical talisman in my head. I thought of Patricia's measured tone over the phone. Escrow, $743,000. Offer, $1.8 million. I could imagine the possibilities. Using money to secure my retirement, to pay for the care I might need if my body began to betray me, to set up a trust for my grandchildren. I could imagine letting them have a soft landing, giving them exactly what would not help them learn. And I could imagine the alternative, holding them to the plan and forcing them to make their own way. I went to bed with the weight of decisions like stones in my chest. They are not stones of cruelty. They are stones of choice. They are the kind of choices that ask whether you will protect your dignity or dissolve it for the sake of an easy peace. On the 30th day, we met again at the kitchen table. Thomas arrived with a neat folder, and Patricia had left a brief message on my voicemail about scheduling a time to talk more about the property. The air felt taut, as if it were holding a breath. David picked at his fingernails like a man who had not slept well. Jessica held the sleeve of her sweater like a talisman. Thomas placed the contract on the table and looked at each of us in turn. "If you sign," he said soberly, "you accept the 90-day plan. If you don't, we'll consider other steps." There is a part of growing old that is learning to make people uncomfortable in the service of truth. I slid my pen out of my purse and placed it on the table. My hand did not shake. I did not hesitate. I had held silence long enough to know it did not protect me. It only made me a smaller thing than I was. David took a deep breath, the kind that pulls the throat inward as if bracing for a fall. He leaned forward and placed his hand on the paper. Jessica hesitated longer, fingers brushing the edge as if the paper might cut her. Then, slowly, she put her name down as well. They signed. For a moment afterward, the house seemed quieter. There was the small release of ink on paper, the exchange of a mutual agreement. It should have felt like peace. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a new stage, a time when consequences would show their face and either teach or punish. We sat for coffee, the way people do after a small storm. None of us spoke loudly. I watched David's eyes. They had the look of a man who had stepped into the shallow end of a deep pool and had to learn to swim. Then my phone buzzed on the table. It was Patricia returning my call. Her name lit the screen like a signal. My heart thudded in a way I hadn't expected. I answered. "Mrs. Williams," she said, brisk and careful, "we need to talk about the escrow. There's more to it than I said in the voicemail. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning?" My mouth tasted like metal. The room tilted again, but this time there was a glint of possibility, the chance to secure my future, or the risk of handing a lifeline at the wrong moment. Thomas glanced at me, then at the paper we had just signed. David's hand tightened into a fist on his cup. Jessica's expression went from taut to calculating in a breath. I didn't know yet what I would decide. I only knew the map I had drawn. Consequences tethered to compassion, boundaries tested by love, leverage used not for spite, but for education. I knew I had chosen a course where they could earn their way back into dignity, and that choice still felt like the right one. The next morning, in an hour that held both promise and peril, I would meet Patricia and listen to what the escrow meant for all of us. For now, the house hummed, and the papers lay on the table like small white promises. The contract was signed. The 90-day clock had started. Outside, the winter light fell across the driveway, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had stood up for myself without becoming someone I would later regret. Patricia's office smelled of new paperwork and lemon cleaner, which is to say it smelled like business. She had maps of ledger lines and a lawyer's ability to make big numbers sound like household chores. She walked me through the escrow situation slowly, like she was untangling a knot. A payment misapplied years ago, a correction that had sat dormant until someone finally noticed. The bottom line, she said, was that there was roughly $743,000 in escrow that could come back into the estate if the paperwork was completed. There was also renewed interest in the commercial building downtown, the same brick property that had once had an offer around $1.8 million before the buyer backed out. I listened as if cataloging the sound of rain on the roof. $743,000 is a number that rearranges options. It is not a miracle. It is a fact that can make some things easier and some things more complicated. Patricia did not tell me to spend it, and she did not tell me to hoard it. She told me what the funds could do, and that decisions about distribution would need to honor existing estate documents unless I exercised my rights in a specific legal way. It was all very precise and very her. On the drive home, the winter air sharp against the windshield, I thought about the ledger again. I thought about the investment account my husband had set aside, the one with roughly $400,000 that I had always planned to live on. Those two numbers together were enough to turn an anxious year into a comfortable decade. They were also enough to tempt me into rescuing habits that had proved ruinous. I called Thomas that afternoon. We met in my kitchen at tea time, his briefcase parked by the chair like a silent partner. He had read Patricia's note and had the calm I always admired in him, the kind of calm you get from seeing messy human decisions before and finding the way back to order. "You have options," he said plainly. "You can distribute, you can sell, you can place assets in trusts, or you can set conditions on benefits. But whatever you do, do it with the express purpose of stewardship, not to punish or to enable." "That is the heart of it," I said. "I don't want to put anyone out on the street. I don't want to step into cruelty, but I also will not create a perpetually soft landing that teaches dependence." Thomas nodded. He drew a line down the middle of a pad and labeled one side protection and the other incentive. Under protection, he wrote things that sounded reassuring: secure retirement, care funds, reserves for health needs. Under incentive, he wrote transition assistance, first month rent, and education job training. It felt right to see the plan in his careful handwriting. Most of the funds protected for my future, a measured portion used as leverage to help them step into independence. We agreed on parameters without the cruelty of specifics. I would not give them the money to sit on. I would not use the funds to bail out bad choices. We would sell, if selling happened, and we would establish a way to secure my retirement and health needs first. A small amount would be set aside as a transition fund, help for rent deposits, short-term rental months to prevent homelessness, and money allocated to job training and restitution for things they had taken without permission. Thomas made clear that any trust or conditional distribution would need precise language and legal oversight. He would prepare the documents, Patricia would review the estate implications, and I would sign whatever prevented easy access unless conditions were met. It felt like a compromise between heart and hard sense. It was, in a word, practical. Word moves in unexpected currents. Carol, the property manager for the small apartment complex on Elm, called 2 days later. She had a clean voice and an inbox full of people who needed a place. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "a unit just opened up. Studio. We have folks on the list, but I wanted to give you a heads up. There's a deposit due in 5 days if you want it held." The apartment came with a small pitch. Near the bus route, freshly painted, a landlord who liked folks who paid their bills on time. In another life, it would have been an unremarkable call. In my life, it had the urgency of a buzzer. Tenants need money for deposits and first months. Landlords need assurances. Deadlines have a way of sharpening good intentions into action. I asked Carol how long they would hold it, and she said plainly, "Not long." I told Thomas and Patricia that same afternoon that if the escrow funds came, I would use a part of the transition fund to cover first month rent as a gift for David and Jessica, if they chose to accept the terms and move by a reasonable deadline. I wanted their move to be dignified, not desperate. I wanted them to have a soft landing that did not feel like a handout. Thomas drafted language that would make the assistance a one-time unconditional exit gift, contingent on vacating by a set date, and showing proof of an employment or training plan. Patricia drafted the trust language so the larger funds remained out of reach unless they met long-term conditions we would all agree upon later. When I explained the plan at the table that night, David's face moved through several frames: hope, calculation, and something like shame. "You'll help us get started," he said slowly. "You'd cover first month?" "Yes," I said. "If you agree to the terms and move out by the date we set, you'll have the chance to keep your dignity while doing the work." I could see the relief wash the lines from his face. Jessica's expression was harder to read. She tilted her head in that way she had when she measured whether a person was useful to her. Then something changed in her eyes. An old stubbornness flickered, and, for better or worse, settled like a shadow. "What about restitution?" she asked. "There will be restitution," Thomas said. "It will be reasonable and calculated. We are not doing vengeance. We are doing repair." That night they sat up late, speaking in ropes of words I couldn't make into knots. They were quieter than in the days before the contract. Urgency had a way of clarifying what mattered. David applied to 3 more jobs and took 2 interviews before the week was out. Jessica filled out an application at the medical supply warehouse, a job that required attention to detail, which, I thought with a small lift of satisfaction, would be a good fit for someone who had spent so much of her life trying to manage other people's things. Then the legal trouble began to rotate outward like a cone of light. I had suspected, in the odd way one suspects a shadow at the edge of a candlelit room, that Jessica's job history had a wrinkle. She had been let go from a previous position for reasons she'd papered over when she first moved in. "They made a fuss," she'd said then, "but there are always details." I heard through a quiet channel, a discreet message to Thomas, then to me, that an old employer had filed a complaint alleging embezzlement and forged purchase orders. The word alleged walked with careful neighbors of no proof yet. Thomas reminded me in his office voice that allegations are not convictions, that the law moves slowly, and that any legal process would take time. At the same time, a notice arrived at our kitchen table addressed to David about an investigation into unemployment benefits he had received in the months he'd been out of work. The notice, clinical and blank in its postage, asked for clarification and documentation. It was the sort of thing bureaucracies send that looks frightening because it is so ordinary. He had applied honestly, as far as I knew, but his paperwork was a mess. The letter did not accuse, it requested. That request moved him. It moved him in a way that a kind word sometimes cannot. I did not gloat. These legal arcs are not theater to be applauded. They are consequences the same way rain is consequence, inevitable and often instructive. I said to Thomas then what I'd said before. I do not want to see them humiliated on the courthouse steps. I want them responsible. Under pressure, people do surprising things. There's a stripped-down urgency to seeking work when you realize a deposit is due and the clock on a gift from a parent will not run forever. David picked up a day job delivering packages. Hard hours, steady pay. He came home the first week exhausted and proud, in a way that had nothing to do with me. Jessica, after a terse phone call with a former employer and a lot of pacing, accepted a part-time position stocking shelves at a medical supplier. She was quiet about it for a few days, and then she began to come home with stories of barcode scanners and late-night shifts that made her sound tired in a way that meant she had started to belong to something that expected her to be present. The apartment manager, Carol, set the move date, 10 days from the offer. It was not an unreasonable span, but it was short enough to force action. We agreed that the transition fund would cover the first month's rent as a gift, not a loan, and that it would be contingent on them vacating by the date and providing proof of employment or an accepted training course. Thomas drafted the short, plain agreement. David and Jessica read it and signed, hands trembling, hands stubborn, hands small and large with the trace of childhood. There were darker shadows that week. The complaint about Jessica's former employment triggered an inquiry that required interviews. I watched her face in the evenings as she tried to reconcile the old life with the new. She was tired in a way I recognized, the fatigue of somebody who has been running in place. The unemployment letter to David meant he had to account for the last 18 months in a way that felt adult. He did it. He produced bank statements, cleared dates, and took the interview. It was not a clean or pretty trail, but it was a trail, and trails, once trod, tend to form habit. There was one night I will not forget. It was late. The house had that small hush when the radiator settles and the streetlight throws a watercolor on the hallway wall. Jessica came to my door and knocked like a child coming to a parent for a small stitch. I opened it, and she looked at me with an honesty I had not seen before. "I'm scared," she said. Not an accusation, not a blame, just a small human thing that made my chest loosen. "You're making it right," I said. "You're doing the hard thing." She blinked as if surprised that this was my measure of mercy. She asked haltingly if she could make restitution for the dishes. I said yes, and gave her the price tags from a recent antique shop for similar items. She went to work adding them up that night like a student learning arithmetic. It felt like progress, the sort of repair that is small and slow. The clock ticked. The move date neared. David had a steady route delivering packages, and his foreman liked his punctuality. Jessica had shifted into a schedule that, while grueling, paid. They scraped for a deposit and asked me for the small help promised. I gave it as I had said I would, a one-time payment to the landlord for the first month, with a note of hope tucked inside. I did not give more than I could afford to lose. I did not create a soft place that would become a trampoline back to old habits. There were moments when the old temptations whispered. A late-night text from a friend offering a quick job that would pay cash. A weekend where the radiator broke and the idea of saving for everything seemed impossible. But the rhythm had changed. Necessity breeds focus. Boredom breeds bad choices. Necessity compels action. Legal proceedings drifted through like weather. The complaint against Jessica became an investigation, a word that has a slow gravity. She met with an attorney who explained that employers sometimes recover funds and sometimes do not. The process would take time and involve evidence and statements. She was anxious, and rightly so, but anxious in a way that pushed her into steady work rather than denial. Those 90 days were like a long exam. Each week, Thomas and I checked the boxes: proof of employment, bank deposit evidence, suitably redacted, sign-ups for financial literacy classes at the community college. We encouraged counseling for the marriage, not as a punitive measure, but as a way to address the fractures that had spilled over into the household. They went. They did the work, haltingly at first, then with the stubbornness that comes when someone understands they are holding the script for their own lives. On day 87, I drove to the building downtown to see what the market felt like. There were for sale signs and a scaffolding that smelled of opportunities that may or may not come to fruition. Patricia called with an update. The escrow had cleared in principle. The funds could be allocated once the paperwork finished moving through the channels. There was an offer being considered on the building. The numbers sounded like a dream and a set of obligations. We did not sign anything that day. We sat with the reality of choice. In the end, I made a decision that felt exactly like the one I had been trying to hold to: protect my future and offer a way for my children to prove they could keep their own. We moved forward to sell the property if the offer stood, but with safeguards. The bulk of the funds would be allocated to a retirement and care reserve. A transition fund would be set aside to provide one-time assistance for moving costs and support for vocational training. A smaller portion would be structured into a trust for the grandchildren with clear, modest milestones that had to be met for distribution. Thomas prepared the instruments. Patricia drew the plan into the estate files. The sale, when it finalized, felt like a quiet tide. We did not shout about numbers at the table. We signed papers with the gravity of those who know what a signature can do. The exact figures were handled in boardrooms and bank filings, and the kind of paperwork that smells of lemon cleaner and diligence. For my purposes, the math translated to security and a plan. The transition fund meant that someone could get out the door and not land on pavement. The trust meant the grandchildren would not be handed everything on a silver tray. The 90 days closed with them in the apartment on Elm. The boxes moved, a small stack of dishes missing their pattern, but arranged in a way that suggested someone was learning. They left the framed picture of my husband in the hallway, carefully wrapped as a gesture of respect. They left the cat carrier and a small plant that had survived Jessica's early neglect. The move felt like the end of a test and the start of a new routine. The months after the 90 days were not perfect. There were setbacks: a missed rent slip one month when David's route was short, a late-night argument that forced the couple into mediation for a weekend. But there were also wins. David's supervisor recommended him for a permanent route after 3 months of punctual work. Jessica was offered steady hours at the medical supplier after a probationary period. They both completed the basic financial literacy course at the college. The restitution for the items taken was a slow drain on their weekends, but they made payments. The embezzlement complaint moved forward as an allegation and then into civil mediation. It was messy and very far from a simple headline, but Jessica took responsibility for what she could, met with the affected employer, and agreed to a restitution schedule that she honored in the months that followed. Most importantly to me, the dynamics in the house shifted. When they came for holidays, once we relearned how to be a family without codependent habits, it felt like visiting a place where the map had been redrawn. David and Jessica brought a casserole and a new habit of calling when they would be late. They ushered me to the couch on some afternoons and took the heavier boxes from my hands when I had errands to fill. It was not penance. It was repair. I settled into a smaller gear of worry. The trust Thomas and Patricia had set up felt like a clean jacket in winter, comfortable, protective, and not too hot. I bought fewer things that felt sentimental and more things that felt smart. A prepaid plan for in-home care hours I might need, a health savings padding that would not be easily tapped, and a social calendar that included my neighbors and the woman who baked muffins and always brought me one on Tuesdays. One evening, 18 months after the spat, David paused in the doorway with a casserole and a look I recognized from his childhood, pride folded with the knowledge of having done it himself. He had a promotion letter folded in his wallet, the kind that says, in ink, that someone trusted you enough to give you more responsibility. Jessica was on the couch reading a list of volunteer shifts at the clinic where she worked 3 nights a week. She had joined a support group, not because anyone told her to, but because she said quietly that she wanted to understand the why behind the things she had done. She had lost some of her edge and gained a steadier voice. It was not for me to claim credit. It was for me to feel the relief. 3 years after the kitchen incident, I sit in my garden more often. The roses have finally come back after years of my careful tending. David brings my newspaper to the porch on Sunday mornings, the way he did when he was 12, and the paper tasted like the whole of the world. Jessica has learned to cook one of my old recipes, and on occasion asks for advice without rolling her eyes. She holds the baby now and hums, tender and unsure, and I watch her like someone scanning for broken places that have started to knit. The grandchildren run in the yard, leaving small prints that remind me that cycles bend but do not always break. They care for me in real practical ways that feel earned and gentle. David learned to follow a pill schedule and sits patiently when I choose the wrong card during bingo at the senior center. Jessica helps with the grocery list and sometimes brings the cat a treat we all approve of. They did not change overnight. They changed because structure required it, because consequences steered them away from habits that would have been comfortable but corrosive, because incentives were aligned with responsibility rather than rescue. When people ask me if I feel vindicated, I say no. Vindication smells like bragging. It is loud and not suited to the life of a woman who has learned humility. What I do feel is resolved. I have kept my dignity. I have kept my house as the house I built with my husband, and I have built protections so that the pretense of care cannot erode into exploitation. I have helped the people I love in ways that required them to help themselves. You might find some of these steps uncomfortable. You might think that selling a property or threatening to change a will is harsh. I understand that. Our choices lived in a moral gray, not righteous revenge, not easy forgiveness, but something that acknowledged both the duty of a parent and the responsibility of an adult child. The lesson, for me, was simple. Love without limits can become cruelty in disguise. Boundaries, given with a firm hand and an open heart, can be the most loving thing we offer. If you are in a house where kindness is being mistaken for consent, you do not have to choose between being cold and being taken. You can be firm. You can be clear. You can set terms that teach people how to stand. And if you are a child who has relied on a parent's love as a hammock rather than a stair, the hard truth is that the work of growing up is often done by showing up to the small, humiliating tasks, job interviews, budgets, restitution, and finishing them. I will not pretend there were no nights of worry after the move. The legal processes took their own time. Allegations took their own course. Everyday life continued to throw small and large problems our way. But when the hard things come, when someone spits in your face, literal or metaphorical, you get to choose how you will meet it. I chose to meet it with a plan that protected me and invited them to return as people I could respect. If you've lived through something like this, I want to hear where you're watching from and what you chose. Share your story in the comments. It helps to know we're not alone. And if this resonated, subscribe for more stories about messy families, hard choices, and the strange grace of boundaries.